nation's history. The man known as the conscience of Congress is arriving at the Capitol for the final time, following 2 days of tributes in Alabama. The hearse carrying the casket of Congressman John Lewis, a lion of the civil rights movement, arriving after a procession through the streets of Washington. And it was quite moving to see the motorcade made several stops at several notable landmarks. First, the Martin Luther King Memorial on the National Mall. Lewis was, after all, a young protege of Dr. King. They met when Lewis was just 18 years old. We then watched as the motorcade stopped at the Black Lives Matter Plaza near the White House, which Lewis visited just June 7th. And to see that then, there were so many crowds there just a short time ago. It was incredible to see that. And then, of course, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, also on the mall, which only exists because Lewis spent 15 years reintroducing the bill to establish it. John Lewis represented Georgia for more than 30 years, and he died on July 17th at the age of 80 after battling pancreatic cancer. Now, John Lewis will lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda, an honor afforded to just a few dozen people in American history. Joining us now is award-winning director Ava DuVernay. She met John Lewis while directing the film Selma, based on the voting rights marches in 1965. Ava, it means so much to have you here on this day. Incredible to not only watch this great respect paid to this man, but I know you're tearing up, but also to look back. My family, we watched Good Trouble last night. And of course, we love your movie, Selma, too. Your thoughts on this day?
What a triumph. You know, what a life well done. Well done. As you were just giving the introduction, I was okay. And then I just thought about what a great person and what a triumphant life. These are happy tears because I know that John Lewis always said that day on the bridge in Selma, he thought he would die that day. And he told me that story in great detail. And to think that he lived to be 80 years old and all the accomplishments and just all the blessings that he's given this country, a country that did not always treat him the same way. And so generous in spirit, one-on-one, but then also just a giant, triumphant life. I know when he was on the bridge in Selma that day, he would have never thought this. Look at what's happening. And so it's just a testament to the spirit of a man who was born out of a movement that still reverberates to this day. You know, the fact that he was so connected to the Black Lives Matter movement that he was proud of that continuation of activism, that he didn't separate himself from it. It's just very telling. And he was just a extremely singular American icon who I'll personally miss very much.
What did he tell you when you were making the movie Selma?
He told me everything. He told me everything in so much detail. We would sit and he answered every question. He was very, very open to the questions, very open to the things that I wanted to know about. Some questions I'd ask, he said, let me, that's way back there. Let me try to jog my memory, get that back. Sometimes he'd say, I need a day to remember that one. That I haven't thought about that part too often. But the spirit of his answers were always very communal. He didn't just want to talk about himself. He wanted to talk about everyone who was involved, everyone, the local leaders on the ground there who had invited him and other folks from different parts of the country into Selma. But his legacy went far beyond Selma. He would talk to me about Georgia, his love for his state. He would talk to me about Troy, Alabama, because he's really just a boy from Troy. I always had to get Troy into the conversation. One memory that I'll just share is that I had the occasion to go to Washington, D.C. to share Selma at President Obama's White House. And Congressman Lewis was with us, obviously. And he took such a a beautiful moment, several beautiful moments to connect with my father, who's since passed away, because my father was from Lowndes County, Alabama. And so I'd look over and they'd be in the corner talking about Alabama, even though we're in the White House, so just a really beautiful man.
You know, Ava, I was struck by certainly the images in 1965 and the beginning of the march and the Alabama state troopers who told them to stop and then, of course, used their batons to attack and to break the skull of John Lewis. And yesterday, in that final procession, Alabama state troopers stood there and saluted his casket.
Yeah.
That's change.
Yes. Well, that was a jaw dropper for me to watch, and it really just speaks to. I texted my sister, who's the director of Memorial and Museum Relations at the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, which is just down the street from the Montgomery Capitol, where we shot the end of Selma and where Dr. King and the whole cadre of leaders ended their march from Selma to Montgomery. And to see that salute made me believe in its most tangible sense that nothing is impossible, that where we are now is not where we will be in the end. That even if you can't see the end of the road, that there's a destination ahead that is going to be different than where you are now. And to think about and look at that footage and see those troopers knock John Lewis and Amelia Boynton straight over with batons, and then to see them carefully lift the same. This is the same group of people, the same agency. These years later, gently carrying his body. If you can't watch that and believe that there's something important even in the symbolism of that, even though we know the deep divide and the deep challenges that we're having in Alabama, that alone symbolically is something that I think had great import and signals us in a direction of growth and change that I think is important to embrace.
We're seeing his hearse arrive now on the east front of the Capitol, the conscience of the Congress, who even after the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida let us sit in, for more than 24 hours. He continued through his entire life that nonviolent resistance of pushing constantly for change in the way that he did. And his legacy lives on so much. And I want to ask you, too, just about where you think it goes from here. What are the steps still that need to be taken? The Black Lives Matter movement that in some ways he helped birth and represents so beautifully. Well, the Voting Rights Act must be restored. There are no protections for people and their right to vote. We see the devastating consequences of that, and in places like Georgia already with disastrous an election process early on this year. We can only expect that to continue. We can't just tell people to vote. The congressman knew this. At this point, it's about defending the right to vote. And so, in so many ways, we've slid back. But I believe, as the congressman did and as the congressman taught me, believe in the power of people. People can create the change. And so if people decide that they want things to be different as it relates to our right to vote, that right should not be something that you have to pay for, have to fight for, have to die for, then things will change. And that's how it changed in Selma. Congressman Lewis and many others demonstrated the danger that they had to face in order to gain the right to vote. And so that is what is happening now in the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a shame that we have to continue to share examples of our personhood and our citizenship, but we will continue to do that until these rights are gained fully. So the easy answer, there's many answers to the question, but the Voting Rights Act is top of mind, especially this year. Jim Clyburn saying just today, Congressman Clyburn saying we should dedicate this election year to John Lewis. And certainly, as everyone needs to exercise their right to vote and be concerned that no voters feel disenfranchised. Ava DuVernay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. We're grateful to have you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we want to bring in Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes because she is there on Capitol Hill just now as John Lewis arrives for this final time, and so that people can pay their respects to him. Nancy?
Nora, it's very quiet, very solemn here on the East Plaza of the U.S. Capitol. The hearse just pulled up behind us a couple of moments ago, and you can see to the right of the hearse a military honor guard waiting. They will be the ones to take the casket out of the hearse and carry it up the east steps of the U.S. Capitol. You'll notice that they themselves are all wearing masks. Off to the left of the hearse, a small group of lawmakers, other well-wishers have gathered in a fenced-off area. I can see Congressman Fred Upton of Michigan, Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia of Texas, others waiting to greet the body as it arrives. And then up at the top of the steps, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the U.S. House, he will direct the casket into the U.S. Capitol, where it will be brought to the rotunda for an arrival ceremony. Because we are in the midst of a pandemic, Nora, this honor is going to look a lot different than it has in the recent past, when individuals like John McCain and Elijah Cummings and George H.W. Bush have received the same honor lying in state. Instead, after this arrival ceremony, after dignitaries, lawmakers, loved ones have had an opportunity to pay their respects, the casket will be brought back out here to the east front of the Capitol. It will be placed at the top of the steps, and then members of the public will be allowed, in a socially distant fashion, to walk along the bottom of the steps to pay their respects and say goodbye. Because after all, that is what this ceremony is all about. That's the entire reason that we have this procedure of honoring people who lie in state. It's so the public can say goodbye to individuals who have made an extraordinary impact on this nation. And this is the way that the organizers, officials here on Capitol Hill have determined is the safest way for the public to be able to pay tribute, deliver that send-off while staying safe.
And we watch now as the family enters the United States Capitol. This is the east front of the Capitol, which in its historical significance is also where you see Marine One land when a president leaves office. Most recently, when Barack Obama left office, they leave from the east front of the Capitol. You see the honor guard there getting ready, as Nancy mentioned, to bring John Lewis's casket into the U.S. Rotunda as John Lewis becomes the first Black lawmaker in U.S. history to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Congressman Elijah Cummings did lie in state in Statuary Hall previously, but this is the first time in the Rotunda, a remarkable honor for the civil rights icon. And perhaps, Nancy, preview for us what we're going to see in this ceremony ahead that's coming up soon.
Absolutely, Nora. So the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, will have some opening remarks. She was a very close friend of John Lewis's. They served together in Congress for 33 years. She's been very open about the depth of their friendship. We'll also hear from Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. We're going to hear some of John Lewis's own words will be played, a recording of some of his thoughts, and that will be, I'm sure, quite moving. We'll also see the traditional laying of wreaths upon the casket, and then we'll also hear a benediction from another one of John Lewis's very close friends, the Majority Whip, James Clyburn, a congressman of South Carolina, who has spoken so movingly about his relationship with John Lewis over these many decades, even before they both came to Capitol Hill. This ceremony is by necessity going to look a lot different than ceremonies that we've seen inside the Capitol in these instances. The chairs will have to be placed farther apart to create the proper social distancing. People will be wearing masks, and that means that there isn't enough room for all the lawmakers and dignitaries who would normally want to be in the rotunda for an event like this to mark history. There will be more seats placed in Statuary Hall, and others, as you can see, have been gathered just here on the east front of the Capitol because there won't be room for all of them. Another thing that's different, Nora, I should point out from the typical scene that we observe when we've seen other individuals lie in state is that we don't see as many members of the public here gathered along the fences as we have in the past. And certainly there's a small crowd that has begun to form, but beyond the pandemic and John Lewis's family expressly urging people who aren't from D.C. not to travel here for this event, it's also one of the hottest days of the summer, 93 degrees right now, heat index above 100, a dangerous time for some people to be outside, particularly for a long period of time, and that's probably keeping some people away as well.
And there you see good trouble on the mask of Congresswoman Karen Bass there. The phrase that, the name of one of John Lewis's book, of course, and the phrase that he used to describe the nonviolent resistance and protest that he embodied throughout his lifetime. I want to bring in New York Times columnist and CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie, who joins us from Charlottesville, Virginia. And Jamelle, I know you've written that it takes people like John Lewis to make a democracy. He's changed so much in his lifetime, changed the course of history.
That's right. Without Lewis, without the actions of the people on that bridge in 1965, there wouldn't be a Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act really should be understood as one of the seminal pieces of legislation, I think, in American history. It enfranchises African Americans in the South. It creates sort of the closest thing to a presumption that every American has the right to vote that we've ever had. And, you know, after its passage in 65, in the next several years, you see an explosion, not just of African American voting, but of African American lawmakers running for office, holding office, all across the political system, from sheriff all the way to congressperson. And so that, if Lewis's legacy was only the Voting Rights Act, I think he would rank as one of the most influential Americans in this country's history.
The timeline, of course, as you note, the march in Selma, I believe in March, and then, of course, signed into law in August by President LBJ, less than a year. And when LBJ said the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice must end, they had met with, including Martin Luther King Jr., they had met with President LBJ and tried to push this, and yet it was that bloody Sunday in Selma and those images that helped in some ways propel Congress and this president to finally act, the past Congress and the president to act, correct?
That's right. I think the story of the Voting Rights Act, and really the story of the Civil Rights Movement as a whole, is an illustration of something that's been very true throughout American history, which is that it takes ordinary citizens doing actions on the ground, protests, sort of organizing to push the political system in the direction of more justice, more freedom, more liberty. These things simply do not happen. It simply does not unfold in that direction. It really does take the actions of, again, ordinary citizens. This is something that I don't think can be stressed enough. The people who marched in Selma, the people who are part of the Civil Rights Movement, the people who would take inspiration from the Civil Rights Movement and over the next several decades to fight for LGBT rights, for women's rights, for the rights of the disabled. These are all ordinary people. These are all people doing things for which they don't necessarily have training, experience, but they are putting their bodies on the line for the sake of this country's democratic principles. And Lewis's life, I think, if it does anything, should remind us that realizing democracy, making democracy real for everyone, takes that kind of commitment.
The commitment, 15 years in the making to get the African American History Museum on the National Mall. You know, the dogged persistence on so many legislative acts that he pushed through in Congress, working side by side, and in some cases in a bipartisan manner as well. I also think about, too, as you mentioned, the Voting Rights Act, Congressman Lewis's description when Barack Obama was elected President of the United States, and in the ceremony afterwards, he went up to President Obama with his program and asked him to sign it, and President Obama signed it because of you, John. And then 4 years later, at the next inauguration, President Obama signed it again and said, it's still because of you, John. Barack Obama giving credit to John Lewis for his ability to run for and become President of the United States.
That's right. And the one thing I would say about that is for all the attention we are giving to John Lewis, we have to also always remember that he was part of a movement. And I think Congressman Lewis, when he was alive, would have said much the same thing, that these things happen because people working together in community, people organizing together, people working in tandem, that the work of improving American democracy isn't the work of singular individuals, but it's the work of Americans acting together as communities, as people organizing together to push forward. And as we are looking in the present, you know, earlier you drew a connection between Congressman Lewis and Black Lives Matter. I think as we look in the present, we should be looking to those communities, to those groupings, to that organizing, to see and to try to understand how they are working in tandem to move their interests forward and move the democracy forward.
It's an excellent point. Jamel Bowie, thank you. I want to bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. He is at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And Ed, I have to ask you, what was it like when the procession drove by just a short time ago?
I was struck, Nora, you know, at midday, early afternoon on a Monday in July, there would be hundreds, if not thousands, of people out here on the mall, tourists, you know, parents with children, people who work in the federal buildings nearby, perhaps on their lunch break. And we stood at the corner of 14th and Constitution just a little while ago as it went by, and there were maybe just 24 people. A handful of them did come out of those federal buildings on their lunch break to pay respects. Others were simply tourists who are here in town, or locals who were out for a jog and suddenly saw the commotion and were told what it was about, and they stopped to watch it go by very quickly. It was an incredible and extraordinary farewell journey for the congressman, beginning of course, at Joint Base Andrews, stopping at the MLK Jr. Memorial, a place, of course, that pays tribute to his mentor and friend, the Lincoln Memorial, and then up to Black Lives Matter Plaza, the newest memorial or monument in this town, paying tribute to the ongoing struggle for civil rights now in the 21st century, and the place where the congressman made his final public appearance to, in essence, bless the movement and bless the site, or at least give it his seal of approval. The mayor of Washington handed a Black Lives Matter street sign to the son of the congressman before the motorcade continued on here to the museum and then on to the Justice Department, the League of Women, the Women Negroes League, and then the Supreme Court. And I'm struck, Nora, the fact that there's nobody in the streets today, or very few people in the streets, I think sort of clashes incredibly with the fact that if you were ever up on Capitol Hill, and you may have seen this when you were there back in the day, Nancy undoubtedly saw it as well, that if tourists happened to come upon him, inevitably somebody in the group understood who he was and reached out and shook his hand or asked for a photo. And he was one of maybe just 2 or 3 of the 535 people who serve up there that might have been recognizable sight unseen to most Americans who come there to pay a visit at the Capitol. So in many ways, a lot of people did already get to pay tribute to him when they saw him in action up on Capitol Hill as a congressman. I saw it several times. I'm sure you guys did as well. And we will see what the crowds are like later today and into tomorrow when people are allowed to pay tribute under the blazing sun.
It's an excellent point, Ed, and Congressman John Lewis, revered by so many that if he was walking in an airport or down a street or in the halls of Congress, you know, there would normally be a crowd around him asking to take a picture, you know, such a giant and not only in civil rights history, but in American history, that he would have many people, it would be difficult for him to get the plane because so many people were asking for photographs or pictures or whatever it may be. And a man who did it with such humility, held such grace, and was so well respected by so many of his colleagues. Want to bring in CBS This Morning Saturday co-host Michelle Miller. She has been in Alabama for the past several days covering that state's goodbye to Representative Lewis. And Michelle, give us a recap of what it's been like the past couple days there in Alabama as part of these 6 days that America will pay tribute and say goodbye to John Lewis.
Well, it started in his hometown of Troy, Alabama, and I think about the service at Troy University on Saturday, recapping the life and times of the boy from Troy, from his siblings. They talk about a young man who seemed to know where he was going, and where he was going was to make change. They knew it from the time that he would talk and preach to the chickens. Part of his chores for the family was to feed the chickens, and he had something to say then. So who else would be a captive audience but those that he would feed? It moved on to like his daring to be different and voice opposition to the segregation laws in the state by simply requesting a library card, they said, and being denied. Again, trying to apply to the university in his hometown, and again, being ignored because of the color of his skin. And what's so interesting about that moment at Troy University in that service is the president pointed out that 2 years ago, they gave him an honorary doctorate. So a full circle moment where the realization of the change in the state and the progress, we should say, that he helped to usher in. From there, being so moved by what happened here in Montgomery, Alabama, watching Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King in the Montgomery bus boycott, that it inspired him to write that preacher, as you once said, and then the invitation. This is where he learned and was trained the very beginning of his activism with Martin Luther King Jr. And so then being moved to go on to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and there receiving a true training in the nonviolent sit-ins and the training of making sure that you were prepared for what was coming at you. The being spat at, being attacked. You know, all of those things, can you imagine a child or a teenager of this time, that happening to you now? And so I just have to say, even before Selma, you know, this man was tested, iron tested in this movement. And then, of course, as we keep mentioning Selma, Alabama, that walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the ceremonies that not only incorporated that moment, but took heart at what those people, those 600 people did. It's quite remarkable. And so many of them were part of those celebrations, including the youngest marcher on that bridge, an 8-year-old girl back then in 1965 by the name of Cheyenne Webb Kreisberg. And she certainly was not, shall we say, she was not shielded from any of the attacks. The tear gas entered her eyes. She witnessed so much violence that she said it traumatized her for the rest of her life. And yet there again was Congressman John Lewis, always offering her a hand each time, every year coming on the pilgrimage to Selma, to the Edmund Pettus Bridge to walk across it, and her always being included and always offering a hand. She said he got her through as a child all the way to today, through the trauma of that moment. And then you look at someone like Congresswoman Terry Sewell, a native of Selma, inspired to become the first Black woman to represent the state of Alabama in Congress. ever. And she says she credited so much of that to watching this man in the lore of what he was able to do. She was 3 months old when that march took place, and yet it is part of her family lore. And what he was able to do on Capitol Hill, as Nancy has described, as I'm sure you know during your days on Capitol Hill, Nora, that he was a mentor who guided people younger than him, but certainly even some of his colleagues from both sides of the aisle. And that is truly his legacy, his ability to reach out, reach in, and connect. And certainly non-violently, but effectively.
So beautifully said, Michelle. And you mentioned Troy, Alabama, where he was from, his desire to go to Troy State College. Not that he wasn't denied, he never even heard back from them. And of course, it was an all-white school. Yeah, and that it was an all-white school, and that was what drove him, his dilemma about, and that's why he wrote to Martin Luther King Jr. And then when MLK Jr. sent him that trip to come meet him to Montgomery, he was met there by a young lawyer named Fred Gray, who had represented Rosa Parks. And this history, and then as detailed in the story, of course, the documentary Good Trouble as well, the decision about whether they would begin this landmark case to sue, which was one way of resistance, of using the courts, and yet his family was so concerned about not only his safety, but their own.
And Nora, I should mention his family, his mother and father were very concerned about him going off to Montgomery, Alabama. He was just 17, 18 years old at the time. They told him, don't get into any trouble, and were concerned when he was arrested. His mark of arrest were legendary. 45 times by the end of his life, 5 times as a congressman, a sitting congressman, and yet that was something that was a shame brought on the family in the 1960s, and there was somewhat of a distance in his family being very concerned at the direction of his life. So when his brothers and sisters spoke of those times and how different he was, it was being disobedient to 2 of the people that he respected the most in his life. The cause trumped his family.
Mm-hmm. But
the conviction as well.
Mm-hmm. And a commitment to nonviolence, as you know, and that quote of his is actually in the program that many of these members of Congress that we see here are waiting in the rotunda. It's a small program, 3 pages, but the last page has a picture of Congressman John Lewis with that phrase, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to stand up, speak out, and find a way to get in the way and get in trouble. Good trouble. Necessary trouble. It doesn't do it justice, me reading it, because his voice, of course, was so powerful and so moving to hear him when you hear him utter that quote. It gives you goosebumps. And there, of course, many of the members of Congress waiting to receive the casket with John Lewis and the program that is set to begin. It's our understanding, too, that in addition to the lawmakers that are there today and will speak, that Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden also plans to pay his respects today. And we're told that the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, also later tonight with his wife, Karen, plans to pay their respects. Nancy Cordes is on the east front of the Capitol to bring us up to date on what we're seeing there. Nancy?
Well, Nora, the body of John Lewis is still inside the hearse. We still see the honor guard waiting to carry the casket up the east front steps of the Capitol, where the House Sergeant at Arms is waiting to greet it. It will be brought into the rotunda, where, as you mentioned, those lawmakers, those dignitaries are waiting to honor him. Typically, at a ceremony like this, you would expect to see the President of the United States. In this case, President Trump is not expected to be here today. He is attending an event in North Carolina. And the president and John Lewis have had a pretty complicated relationship over the years. John Lewis boycotted President Trump's inauguration. He said that he felt that Trump was an illegitimate president, and that decision by John Lewis, who has such an impact in his caucus, inspired other Democrats to do the same. And that really angered President Trump, who tweeted that Lewis was all talk, 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 and no action, which, when you know anything about the story of John Lewis's life, is a pretty unbelievable statement. He also argued that Lewis's district in Georgia was crime infested and that he should focus on that. The president saying something similar a couple of years ago about the district represented by Elijah Cummings in Maryland, two late African-American lawmakers. The president did put out a tweet when Lewis died last week, calling him a civil rights hero, ordering that the flags at the White House be dropped to half staff, but he will not be here today, Nora.
Nancy Cordes, thank you. Want to bring back in New York Times columnist Jamal Bowie and CBS News contributor. And Jamal, that tension that still exists, that political tension between the president and John Lewis. And just as we are in the midst of an election year, I'm struck by what the Majority Whip James Clyburn said earlier today in an interview on CNN. He said we should dedicate this election year to John Lewis. What do you make of where that stands now?
I think so. It's no secret that President Trump has been quite disdainful, not just of Congressman Lewis, but is very disdainful of the Black Lives Matter movement. Has spent his time in office, I think you can fairly say, stirring up racial resentment, racial anger, and so. Given that background, I don't think Congressman Clyburn is wrong when he says that. I think that the election this year very much represents a contest between the president's vision of the country, a contrast between the president's vision of the country and John Lewis's vision of the country, which is a much more, I think, expansive and inclusive vision than the one the president has.
Jamel, I want to pause just for a moment because we may have just witnessed a member of the honor guard it looks like fainted. It's so hot in Washington. As Nancy Cordes had mentioned earlier, I was thinking about the members of the honor guard too when we were watching them at Joint Base Andrews. It's so hot when you're on a tarmac, certainly, and they're of course in their full dress blues, their formal gear, and now it appears that one of them may have fainted due to the heat. So this may delay a bit of the procession at this moment, and certainly we wish him well. And this is one of the concerns about the heat on a day like today, and people applauding. Very, very hot indeed, and I hope that he is okay. And Nancy Cordes is right there. And Nancy, what did you see?
I saw him, Nora, fall to the ground, and he was lying there, not moving for a couple of minutes. Immediately, we saw members of law enforcement come to his aid. We saw the other members of the military honor guard move to the side a couple of feet, and then such good news. He was able to get up on his own. Looks like a member of the U.S. Navy, and he has just been escorted away. But yes, as you pointed out, it is an incredibly hot day out here, even hotter here on the east front of the U.S. Capitol, with all this brick and concrete. The sun just reflects off of it. We're lucky enough to be covered by an umbrella to shield us from the sun, and we have fans here. But these members of the honor guard in full dress, they don't have that same opportunity. Now we see the rest of them coming to the hearse to escort the casket up the steps of the east front of the Capitol.
Let's take a moment to listen in.
Sidestep. March. Forward. March. Mark time. Bears, halt. Ready, step. 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 Forward, march. Mark on. Bears, walk. Center, fix. Side step. March.
And there you see the inside of the Capitol Rotunda, and that is the Lincoln Catapult, which was constructed after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln to hold the casket. It is used to this day, and there it sits at the center of the rotunda with members of Congress socially distanced, all wearing masks, as the ceremony is set to begin to honor a man who served 17 terms, more than 30 years in the U.S. Congress, elected in 1986. Nancy Cordes is our chief congressional correspondent. And Nancy, I understand we will hear first from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
That's right. Speaker Pelosi, who, along with working alongside John Lewis, being colleagues for 33 years, was also a close friend of his and has spoken very movingly this week about their relationship and about how much she learned from him, what an ally he was, the kind of moral clarity that he lent to every debate. So she's going to speak about her colleague and friend, John Lewis. We will then hear from Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. We will hear Amazing Grace sung there inside the Capitol Rotunda. And Nora, what really struck me when we saw that shot of the rotunda from above, we've never seen a sight quite like this. All these chairs right there, socially distanced from one another because of the coronavirus, creating really quite a moving sight there in the Capitol Rotunda. People not able to sit close to one another as they normally would. The room, this magnificent hall in the middle of the U.S. Capitol, not able to hold as many lawmakers as it normally would because of the pandemic we are dealing with right now. And a reminder that because the U.S. Capitol has been closed to the public since March, members of the public will not be able to process through the rotunda afterwards to pay their respects. They'll have to say goodbye from outside.
And this special ceremony to honor and pay tribute to John Lewis in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda is about to begin. Let's listen in.
Ready to face. Forward. March.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives.
Good afternoon. It is an official, personal, and very sad honor to welcome our colleague, John Lewis, back to the Capitol, to welcome his family and his many friends, to acknowledge his sacred life. Please stay standing for the invocation by Reverend Dr. Granger Browning, Jr., Ebenezer AME Church.
Let us bow our heads in a word of prayer. Eternal God, our Father, I come before you today in the name of Jesus, thanking you for the many different faiths and beliefs and religions that make up your beloved community that come to celebrate the life and the legacy of John Lewis. We come today thanking you for the faith foundations that his mother and father established in Troy, Alabama. We thank you for his leadership of SNCC and the March on Washington. We thank you for how he was bloodied for us, bruised for us, he marched for us, sat in for us, and was willing to give up his life that we might have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And on today, as his colleagues and friends and especially family members come as he lays in state in this hallowed rotunda, we come on this day recommitting ourselves to march as he marched, to ballot boxes, and to this year for mailboxes, and for voting rights, and for civil rights, and for human rights. And we'll keep doing that until that day justice rolls down like mighty waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And finally, on July 17th, we want to say thank you that he crossed another bridge, not the Edmund Pettus bridge that we pray that one day will be named the John Lewis Memorial Bridge, but the bridge from earth to glory. And when he got there, Elijah Cummings and the Congressional cloud of witnesses welcomed him home. As they marched down that street paved of gold, we want to say thank you from Emmett Till to George Floyd, said thank you for allowing our deaths not to be in vain. And when he got to the lily white throne, we want to say thank you. He heard you say, well done, thy good and faithful servant. You have done the good fight, and you have kept your eyes on the prize, and now enter into the joy of the Lord. And after you said that, Gabriel told the angels to lift every voice and sing. And we heard Dr. King in the background saying, free at last, free at last. The consciousness of Congress is free at last. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Gentlemen, the Honorable Mitch McConnell, Majority Leader of the United States Senate.
Please be seated. In his memoirs, John Lewis described a childhood home that was quite different from the place he lies today. That farmhouse in Pike County, Alabama, had no running water or electricity. It stood on the first land his father's family had ever owned, in a part of the country where segregation had led to almost total isolation along racial lines. It would have been hard to conceive back then that the young child tending his family's chickens would, by age 23, be leading the movement to redeem American society, that he'd be addressing hundreds of thousands of civil rights marchers from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I was lucky enough to be there that day. I marveled at the massive crowds. The sight gave me hope for our country. That was John's doing. Even on that day, as his voice echoed across the mall, I wonder how many dared imagine that young man would come to walk the halls of the Congress. America's original sin of slavery was allowed to fester for far too long. It left a long wake of pain, violence, and brokenness that has taken great efforts from great heroes to address. John's friend, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., famously said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." But that is never automatic. History only bent toward what's right because people like John paid the price to help bend it. He paid that price at every Nashville lunch counter where his leadership made segregation impossible to ignore. He paid it in every jail cell where he waited out hatred and oppression. He paid that price in harassment and beatings from a bus station in South Carolina to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. John Lewis lived and worked with urgency because the task was urgent. But even though the world around him gave him every cause for bitterness, he stubbornly treated everyone with respect and love. All so that, as his friend Dr. King once put it, we could build a community at peace with itself. Today, we pray and trust that this peacemaker himself now rests in peace. All of John's colleagues stand with his son, John Miles, their family, and the entire country in thanking God that he gave our nation this hero it needed so badly. May all of us that he will leave behind under this dome pray for a fraction of John's strength to keep bending that arc on toward justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives.
To the family of John Lewis, welcome to the Rotunda. Under the dome of the U.S. Capitol, we have bid farewell to some of the greatest Americans in our history. It is fitting that John Lewis joins this pantheon of patriots, resting upon the same catafalque of President Abraham Lincoln. John revered President Lincoln. His identification with Lincoln was clear 57 years ago at the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, where John declared, "Our minds, souls, and hearts cannot rest until freedom and justice exist for all people." Words that ring true today. Mr. Leader, I too was there that day, our student years. Between then and now, John Lewis became a titan of the civil rights movement and then the conscience of the Congress. Here in Congress, John was revered and beloved on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol. We knew that he always worked on the side of the angels, and now we know that he is with them. And we are comforted to know that he is with his beloved Lillian. And may it be a comfort to John's son, John Miles, and the entire Lewis family, Michael Collins, the entire staff, that so many mourn their loss and are praying for them at this sad time. God truly blessed America with the life and leadership of John Lewis. We thank you for sharing him with us. May he rest in peace. John Lewis often spoke of a beloved community, a vision that he shared with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of the community connected and uplifted by faith, hope, and charity. And indeed, John had deep faith, believing that every person has a spark of divinity, making them worthy of respect. And he had faith in the charity of others, which is what gave him so much hope. And as he wrote in his book, release the need to hate, to harbor division, and the enticement of revenge. Release all bitterness. Hold only love, only peace in your heart, knowing the battle for good to overcome evil is already won. John the Optimist. Through it all, John was a person of greatness. He also was a person of great humility, always giving credit to others in the movement. John committed his life to advancing justice and understood that to build a better future, we had to acknowledge the past. Exactly 1 year ago, it was a privilege to be with John and members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Madam Chair, Karen Bass, on a pilgrimage to Ghana to observe 400 years since the arrival of the first slaves from Africa. Some of the descendants of those slaves would build this Capitol, where John lies in state on the Lincoln Catapult. I wish you could have seen the response that John received when he was introduced to the Ghana Parliament. My colleagues are shaking their heads. It was overwhelming. But I wish you could have seen him at the door of no return, which enslaved people were sent through onto the death ships to cross the Atlantic. I wish you could have seen what it meant to him. He knew that the door of no return was a central part of American history, just as is the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the March on Washington, the Selma March to Montgomery. When John made his speech 57 years ago, he was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington program. How fitting it is that in the final days of his life, he summoned the strength to acknowledge the young people peacefully protesting and in the same spirit of that march, taking up the unfinished work of racial justice, helping complete the journey begun more than 55 years ago. We have all seen the photographs of John being brutally beaten in Selma, which painted an iconic picture of injustice. What a beautiful contrast to see John and the mayor of Washington, who's with us today, at the Black Lives Matter Plaza, standing in solidarity with the protesters, an iconic picture of justice that will endure and will inspire our nation for years to come. John firmly focused on the future, on how to inspire the next generation to join the fight for justice. And his quote, "to find a way to get in the way." As one of the youngest leaders of the Freedom Rides, March on Washington, as I said, and March to Montgomery, he understood the power of young people to change the future. When asked what someone can do who is 19 or 20 years old, the age that he was when he set out to desegregate Nashville, Lewis replied, "A young person should be speaking out for what is fair, what is just, what is right. Speak out for those who have been left out and left behind. That is how the movement goes forward," John said. Imagine the great joy he had traveling the country to share that message of action with young people. No need to imagine. It is my personal privilege right now for me to yield to our beloved colleague, the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Congressman John Lewis.
I grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was only 4 years old, my father had saved $300. And with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. My family still own that land today. How many of you remember when you were 4? Now, what happened to the rest of us? It was many, many years ago when we would visit the little town of Troy, visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, visit Birmingham, I saw those signs that said white men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But one day in 1955, 15 years old, in the 10th grade, I heard about Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on our radio. 1957, I met Rosa Parks at the age of 17. In 1958, at the age of 18, I met Martin Luther King Jr., and these two individuals inspired me to get in the way, to get in trouble. So I come here to say to you this morning, on this beautiful campus, with your great education, you must find a way to get in the way. You must find a way to get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. Use your education. You have wonderful teachers, wonderful professors, researchers. Use what you have. Use your learning. Use your tools to help make our country and make our world a better place where no one will be left out or left behind. You can do it and you must do it. It is your time. In a few short days, we will commemorate what we call the Mississippi Summer Project. For more than 1,000 students from all over America, many from abroad, made a trip to Mississippi to encourage people to register to vote. And the summer night of June 21st, 1964, 3 young men that I knew, 2 whites and 1 African American, Mickey Werner, Andy Goodman, and James Chaney, went out to investigate the burning of an African American church that was used for voter registration workshop. These 3 young men were detained by the sheriff, taken to jail, taken out of jail, turned over to the Klan, where they were beaten, shot, and killed. And I tell students today, these 3 young men didn't die in Vietnam. They didn't die in the Middle East or Eastern Europe. They didn't die in Africa or Central or South America. They died right here in our own country, trying to help all of our citizens become participants in the democratic process. As young people, you must understand that there are forces that want to take us back to another period. But you must say that we're not going back. We made too much progress and we're going forward. There may be some setbacks, some delays, some disappointment, but you must never, ever give up or give in. You must keep the faith and keep your eyes on the prize. That is your calling, that is your mission, that is your moral obligation, that is your mandate. Get out there and do it. Get in the way. In the final analysis, we all must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. We all live in the same house. And it doesn't matter whether we are black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. It doesn't matter whether we are straight or gay. We are one people, we are one family. We all live in the same house. Be bold. Be courageous. Stand up. Speak up. Speak out. And find a way to create the beloved community, the beloved world, a world of peace, a world that recognizes the dignity of all humankind. Never become bitter, never become hostile, never hate, live in peace. We are one. one people, and one love. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Whitley Phipps.
was blind, but now I see.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Whitney Phipps.
attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul, it is well with my soul, it is well, it is well with my soul.
God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference, living one day at a time, accepting hardships as a pathway to peace, taking as he did the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats until you are escorted to pay your respects by the Sergeant at Arms.
Congressman John Lewis's son paying his final respects there in the U.S. Rotunda, Capitol Rotunda. Members of John Lewis's family paying their respects. John Lewis was one of 10 children from Troy, Alabama. His parents, sharecroppers. Want to bring in Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill. And beautiful ceremony to honor John Lewis, who now will lie in state for the next 2 days. Nancy?
A really beautiful ceremony, Nora, and such a moving choice to have those lawmakers, other dignitaries, hear the recorded words of John Lewis himself, a reminder of what a stirring orator he was. Earlier this week, Hank Johnson, his fellow congressman from Georgia, described his voice, his speaking style to me this way. He said, "You couldn't help but to listen to him because it would rattle your soul. He was such a powerful man, and yet the message that he spoke, just simple, not highfalutin words, just speaking so that even a child could understand his message. He had a very special way of communicating. It's a reason why he found himself in the pages of history by the time he was a very young man. It's the reason that he was so impactful on Capitol Hill, one of many reasons anyway, but one of the things that gave him such great power and stature was that speaking style that really had such an impact on the people around him, both those that agreed with him and those who didn't.
And that launched him onto the national stage as a 23-year-old in the March on Washington. Nancy Cordes, our chief congressional correspondent, thank you. And tonight and tomorrow, Lewis will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda before making one final trip back home to Georgia, his final resting place. And on Thursday, we'll bring you full coverage of a celebration of life ceremony for Lewis at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church, once led by his mentor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN, and you can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app. There will be more on your local news on this CBS station, and we will have a full wrap-up for you tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report in honor of Congressman John Lewis. I'm Norah O'Donnell, CBS News, Washington.
You've been watching CBS's special report as people have been paying their respects to Congressman John Lewis, laying in state at the U.S. Capitol. We will continue our coverage of his extraordinary life and legacy, as well as the rest of the day's news after a break, so stick with us. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
COVID has taken the lives of tens of thousands of Americans. Rural areas like this here on Navajo Nation are especially hit hard.
15 to 30% of our Navajo citizens don't have running water.
In any indigenous reservation, there is a shortage of physicians.
Native Americans are amongst the most vulnerable and hardest hit by COVID.
Yeah, the more we lose our elders to COVID-19, the more we lose our language and our way of life.
We need to bring awareness to the attention of Washington, D.C. and United States citizens that there is a need to focus on the first citizens of this country.
In 60 years, we went from about 100,000 factory workers to probably about 7,000.
Off in the distance, you can see some factories that are still humming, but most of them are just kind of abandoned.
The restaurant industry right now is one of the largest and fastest growing industries in America. And yet it continues to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States.
Barely anybody's making enough to live.
You're donating plasma to get by.
It's literally a slave wage.
I don't remember growing up like this. My mom didn't have to go to food banks. It's pretty sad.
Even really young kids are feeling what's going on right now. How should parents be talking to them about this whole question of racial justice?
How do we embrace this moment and turn it into real change?
What we really must focus on is moving from protesting to policy.
Join Gail, Anthony, and Tony on CBS This Morning.
CBSN Los Angeles. Get local news, breaking news, anytime, anywhere.
It's easy to find us, and it's free.
Download the CBS News app on your favorite devices. CBSN Los Angeles, streaming 24/7.
You can watch CBSN 24/7.
We've got an amazing story to share with you.
I understand you have some breaking news.
How does it all play out?
It's quite an adventure here at CBSN.
It's been a day.
Doctors and scientists in a race against time to cure coronavirus will show just how close they are, racing to a cure on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell.
Tributes continue to pour in for television icon Regis Philbin. Philbin is most well known for co-hosting Live with Regis and Kathy Lee, and later Live with Regis and Kelly. He also hosted the popular primetime game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Regis launched his career in the 1950s on the Joey Bishop Show and holds the Guinness World Record for most hours on television. His family said the TV personality died Friday of natural causes. He was 88 years old. Actress Olivia de Havilland is being remembered for her 7 decades-long career. She's best known for her role as Melanie Hamilton in the 1939 film Gone with the Wind, which has been criticized in recent years for its portrayal of slavery and the antebellum South. De Havilland won Oscars for her acting in To Each His Own and The Heiress in the 1940s. She died at her home in Paris Sunday at 104 years old. The WNBA season kicked off Saturday with a statement against racial injustice. Players from the New York Liberty and Seattle Storm left the court during the national anthem as a sign of peaceful protest. The teams then held a moment of silence for 26 seconds to represent Breonna Taylor's age. She was the Louisville EMT who was shot and killed by police in her own home while sleeping. Earlier this month, the league announced that the 2020 season will be dedicated to raising awareness about social justice issues. And on the men's side, the voting rights group founded by NBA star LeBron James and other black athletes and entertainers is committed to donate $100,000 to help former felons in Florida seeking to vote in the November election. LeBron's More Than a Vote initiative is expected to pay off outstanding fees and fines associated with those felony convictions. In a tweet last week, he said, quote, "This is a fight about their constitutional right to vote being denied." LeBron, who moved to the Los Angeles Lakers in 2018, spent 4 seasons with the Miami Heat, bringing in 2 NBA championships to South Florida. And coming up in our next hour, cases of the coronavirus continue to surge across the country as extra jobless benefits expire for tens of millions of Americans. Plus, as Texas deals with soaring cases of the coronavirus, the region is hit by a hurricane. How the pandemic is complicating efforts to keep people safe. And countdown to November with just 99 days until the election, how the race is shaping up this far out. Plus, we'll have results of a new CBS News Battleground Tracker poll. You're streaming CBSN, always on.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. Boom. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait,
There's more. Experience thought-provoking,
I'm open to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
COVID has taken the lives of tens of thousands of Americans. Rural areas like this here on Navajo Nation are especially hit hard.
15 to 30% of our Navajo citizens don't have running water.
In any indigenous reservation, there is a shortage of physicians.
Native Americans are amongst the most vulnerable and hardest hit by COVID.
Yeah, the more we lose our elders to COVID-19, the more we lose our language and our way of life.
We need to bring awareness to the attention of Washington, D.C. and United States citizens that there is a need to focus on the first citizens of this country.
In 60 years, we went from about 100,000 factory workers to probably about 7,000.
Off in the distance, you can see some factories that are still humming, but most of them are just kind of abandoned.
The restaurant industry right now is one of the largest and fastest growing industries in America. And yet it continues to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States.
Barely anybody's making enough to live.
You're donating plasma to get by.
It's literally a slave wage.
I don't remember growing up like this. My mom didn't have to go to food banks. It's pretty sad.
Even really young kids are feeling what's going on right now. How should parents be talking to them about this whole question of racial justice?
How do we embrace this moment and turn it into real change?
What we really must focus on is moving from protesting to policy.
Join Gail, Anthony, and Tony on CBS This Morning.
CBSN Los Angeles. Get local news, breaking news, anytime, anywhere.
It's easy to find us, and it's free.
Download the CBS News app on your favorite devices CBSN Los Angeles, streaming 24/7.
You can watch CBSN 24/7.
We've got an amazing story to share with you.
I understand you have some breaking news.
How does it all play out?
It's quite an adventure here at CBSN.
It's been a day.
You can watch CBSN 24/7.
We've got an amazing story to share with you.